Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers hearing. To start this lecture, we'll first cover the anatomy of the mammalian ear by looking at the structures and some of the functions of the human ear. Then we'll take a look at how sound is collected and perceived within that ear structure. And finally, we'll use this as a baseline to look at odontocetes, which have acute hearing in the water, and look at some of the adaptations that they've had to make in order to get that excellent hearing, particularly in an aqueous environment, not in a land environment. So let's get started. Let's take a look at this cross-section of the mammalian ear. We're not going to cover all the structures, but we'll cover some of the major ones. Of course, the one that everybody thinks of is the external ear, which is also known as the pinna, or pinnae for plural. When sound is collected in the pinna, it is conveyed into what's called the external acoustic meatus. This is basically where you can take your finger or possibly a little cotton swab and shove it down that little ear canal. Sometimes it's also called the auditory canal. And then once you reach the end of the external acoustic meatus, you reach the tympanic membrane. Now, the common name for the tympanic membrane is the eardrum. So what you know as your eardrum is more scientifically known as the tympanic membrane. From there, sound is actually transferred to a set of three tiny bones called the auditory ossicles, otherwise more commonly known as the ear bones. And from the ear bones, we reach this snail-like structure called the cochlea. And the cochlea is going to be connected to the nervous system to send that sound information to the brain for processing. Now, the external part of the ear, the pinna and the external acoustic meatus, are going to be the two sites where sound is collected on land. So as you have sound waves that are basically penetrating or hitting your skull, they're being collected by the pinna, which almost works like a reverse megaphone in terms of collecting and funneling that sound wave down to the external acoustic meatus. The sound waves then hit the tympanic membrane or the eardrum, where they actually set the tympanic membrane bouncing, similar to bouncing on a small trampoline. So the larger the sound waves, or the larger amplitude the sound waves, the more vigorous the tympanic membrane is going to bounce. Now, where it gets really interesting is actually on the other side of that eardrum. The eardrum just ends up being like a big satellite for that sound wave, but the tympanic membrane itself is actually physically connected to the three auditory ossicles. And what happens when the tympanic membrane starts vibrating is that it starts the three auditory ossicles vibrating as well. And if you look carefully at the anatomical design, you might notice, in fact, that the first one here, this is the malleus, the incus, and then finally the stapes over here, that if this is going to vibrate like this, it's going to send this one vibrating, and finally this one vibrating. And we call that a rocking motion that is shown by that stapes. Now, what's interesting is that final ear bone, or the stapes, is plugged into the cochlea. In this picture here, you can see the light shining behind the tympanic membrane, and you can see the auditory ossicles ending right here with that stapes that's going to rock back and forth. So we say that the pressure waves of the sound are converted into mechanical motion, whereas the stapes is going to rock back and forth. From there, that rocking back and forth of the auditory ossicles, particularly the stapes, is going to actually push on fluid that's located within the spiral-shaped bony structure known as the cochlea. And that pushing of fluid ends up creating a pressure wave similar to the way that you might push on a waterbed on one corner and watch it ripple across that waterbed. And so that pressure wave ends up being detected by sensory cells that are inside the cochlea, and then those sensory cells, once they pick up on that signal, send the information to the brain. And that's how we get sound sound perception. Now, where I really want to share the similarities is that the cochlea and the auditory ossicles are going to be the same thing, regardless of whether you're looking at a human or a marine mammal. In other words, if you want the brain to pick up on sound, you've got to get those auditory ossicles swinging back and forth. And that's where our real fundamental crutch is going to lie in terms of how does air differ from water. So to look at what I mean, let's actually turn to what happens in air. When you have air and you've got sound waves coming at you from one direction, you have a slight delay in time that is picked up through your acoustic meatus, or your external acoustic meatus, that allows you to sense direction. So in other words, if somebody snaps on your right side, they take their fingers and they just make a snapping noise, you know, even if you don't see the snapping, you know that the sound is coming from your right side. Now, that doesn't mean that your left side doesn't pick up on the sound. You could completely cover your right ear and you would still hear it in your left ear. So clearly your brain is able to pick up the fact that the sound waves are hitting your auditory ossicles through the external acoustic meatus at slightly different times, and that allows you to have directional hearing or pinpoint the direction of sound. Now, this is a very important property that ends up being lost in water when we swim. When we swim, when humans swim, or any really terrestrial mammal swims, we lose the location of sound. So if somebody snaps on your right side, you're not going to hear it as coming from your right side. It's going to seem directionless. And part of this is because of the way that sound propagates in water versus air. So let's come over here to this dot camera and take a look at what I mean. So here I have a diagram of a face, and we basically have our pinna, our external acoustic meatus, our tympanic membrane, and then our auditory ossicles. Now, when sound travels through land or through air, it's going to bounce off the skull. So really, the only sound waves that are going to get through are going to be picked up by this pinna and funneled through the external acoustic meatus. Everything else is going to bounce off. So that means that sound has to come here, and then it has to come through the other side as well. In other words, the only place for sound transmission is here. In water, it's not like that. In water, the sound waves end up permeating the bone anyway or place, coming from all directions. And so unfortunately, this all causes the auditory ossicles to vibrate without needing to necessarily go through the external acoustic meatus. The result, unfortunately, is that those sound waves are gonna hit these auditory ossicles here, as well as keep going and hitting the other side almost at the same time, which means that you do not pick up on clear sound and you do not pick up on directional sound. So this obviously is going to have consequences for aquatic mammals that spend all of their time in water. So that brings up this question: how on earth do these marine mammals clearly hear in the water when we as terrestrial mammals cannot? So they must have several adaptations or modifications that help allow them to hear in the water. And really, we're going to start with the external acoustic meatus and the pinna. Now, you might notice here in this dolphin that there is no pinna. It's been completely lost. They do have an external acoustic meatus, which is shown in the red circle, but it's tiny and it actually isn't even functional. And as we stated earlier, this is because in water, the sound waves won't use a little narrow channel like that. So they do have one, but it seems to be vestigial and non-functional. So what on earth do they use? Well, again, it's all about how to get the auditory ossicles rocking from one source, and that's the goal. If we put the skull in the water, and the fact that the skull and the water have very similar densities, sound waves then penetrate the skull. So they do something really interesting to help alleviate that. To ensure that the auditory ossicles are insulated from the water, they actually put them in their own bone. So they'll take the 3 ear bones and encase them in their own bone called the petrotympanic bone, which is something humans don't have, and then put it in a place in the skull that is completely surrounded by air, so that because you have this air insulation, when sound waves end up hitting that air pocket, it bounces off. In other words, the sound waves do not penetrate through the superficial skull bones to the deeper auditory ossicles in the same way that they do in humans. And we actually can come over and see these on the underside of a dolphin. So this is the dolphin skull, this is the underside of the cranium, and what we see here, this right here is going to be the petrotympanic bone, and you can see that it's completely encased in an airspace right there. That allows it to be isolated and therefore insulated from sound waves that are coming and hit these, but then basically once they penetrate and try to get to that airspace, they're bounced right back. That allows these odontocetes to actually have one place that they end up sending their sound waves from. So again, the major adaptation, take the auditory ossicles, put them in their own petrotympanic bone, and then isolate that bone with a cavity of air, very similar to what mammals use by just using air versus bone density differences. So how is sound transmitted? Well, it turns out it's transmitted through their lower jaw. When you take a look at the lower jaw of an odontoceti, you realize that there's going to be a very large depression here on the inside, which hopefully you can see right here. This is the lower jaw, that very large depression. That's all filled with fat, and it's called the fatty channel. And what happens is that fatty channel ends up being connected to that petrotympanic bone. So what happens then is that sound waves will actually be collected in that fatty channel and processed and run right up to that petrotympanic bone, where the petrotympanic bone then vibrates as part of the auditory ossicle rocking. So again, very interesting idea here, because what's clearly happened is that sound transmission occurs through the lower jaw. In other words, dolphins have lost their external ear, and what we think of as the external ear and the external acoustic meatus has become replaced with hearing through your jaw. So this is non-functional, and this is going to be the new external ear, this lower jaw and that fatty channel within. One more interesting idea with this is the idea that the eardrum itself has also been modified to the point of being non-functional. In other words, the eardrum is going to, because it's connected to the external acoustic meatus, not be useful. So how do the auditory ossicles rock if it's not by the bouncing of the tympanic membrane or the eardrum? Well, it turns out that it's the actual bone, the petrotympanic bone, that then is connected directly to the auditory ossicles, which are inside. And when sound waves travel up that fatty channel in the lower jaw and they push on that bone vibrates and sends those auditory ossicles rocking, which then of course transmits the sound into the cochlea, which is picked up by the brain. And that is one of the neatest adaptations I have ever learned about in marine mammals, how they hear underwater. And with that, I will see you next time.